The crisp autumn evening in Manhattan painted the city in golden hues as James Cooper wheeled himself toward Le Cirque, one of the most prestigious restaurants in New York City. The wheels of his chair made soft sounds against the smooth sidewalk as he approached the elegant entrance, his heart beating with excitement and nervousness. James had planned this evening for months. At 34, the former Marine had learned to navigate life differently after returning from Afghanistan, but his determination remained unshaken. His military jacket, though not brand new, was carefully pressed, and his combat boots were polished to perfection, small details that mattered to a man who had served his country with pride. The restaurant's exterior sparkled with warm lighting, and well-dressed people walked in and out, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of New York traffic. James checked his watch, 7:00 p.m., right on time for his reservation. He had saved up for 6 months to afford this special evening, picking up extra hours at the Veterans Support Center where he worked as a counselor. Inside the restaurant, unknown to James or most of the other diners, former President Donald Trump sat in a corner booth partially hidden by an ornate room divider. He was meeting with 3 business associates, discussing plans for a new veterans employment initiative. The smell of fine cuisine filled the air, and soft classical music played in the background. As James approached the entrance, he could see his reflection in the glass doors, a proud veteran who had earned a Purple Heart serving his country. His wheelchair hadn't changed who he was inside, though some people seemed to see only the chair and not the man. Tonight was about proving to himself that he could still enjoy the finer things in life, just like anyone else. The doorman, an older gentleman with kind eyes, immediately opened the door for James, offering a warm, "Good evening, sir." This small gesture of respect brought a smile to James's face. The restaurant's interior was even more impressive than he had imagined. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the deep burgundy walls, and fine art adorned every corner. At the host station, a young man in an impeccably tailored suit stood reviewing reservation lists. His expression shifted noticeably as James approached, his eyes moving from the wheelchair to James's casual military jacket. The host's demeanor changed from professional to dismissive in an instant. "May I help you?" the host asked, his tone carrying a hint of skepticism that made James's heart sink. James maintained his composure, drawing on years of military discipline. "Yes, I have a reservation for 7:00 p.m. under Cooper," he replied confidently. The host barely glanced at his booking system before responding, "I'm terribly sorry, but we appear to be fully booked this evening. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the casual dining establishments down the street." From his corner booth, Trump paused mid-conversation, his attention drawn to the exchange taking place at the entrance. Years of business dealings had given him a keen ear for tension in people's voices, and something about this interaction didn't sit right with him. James reached for his phone, pulling up the confirmation email he had received just days before. "There must be some mistake," he said calmly, though his fingers tightened slightly on his wheelchair's armrests. "I have a confirmed reservation, and I specifically mentioned I would need wheelchair-accessible seating." The host's expression remained unchanged as he replied, "I'm afraid there must have been an error in our system. We simply cannot accommodate certain situations tonight. Perhaps you could return another time." His eyes darted to other patrons, some of whom were now watching the scene unfold. Trump's business associates noticed his attention had shifted. Following his gaze, they too began to observe the interaction at the host station. The former president's expression hardened as he watched the host dismiss a man who was clearly a veteran. James sat straighter in his wheelchair, his military bearing evident as he reached for his military ID. He hadn't wanted to make an issue of his veteran status. He had never been one to seek special treatment, but the host's thinly veiled discrimination was testing his patience. The Purple Heart recipient card was visible alongside his military ID, catching the light of the chandeliers above. The evening that James had planned so carefully was crumbling before his eyes. He thought about all the extra hours he'd worked, the encouragement from his friends at the Veterans Center, and his own promise to himself that his disability wouldn't define his life's experiences. Yet here he was, facing the kind of discrimination he had hoped to leave behind. The tension at the host station was growing thicker by the minute. The young host's dismissive attitude had caught the attention of nearby diners, who were now watching the scene unfold with mixed expressions of concern and curiosity. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended not to notice. "I understand you have a reservation," the host said, his voice barely maintaining a veneer of politeness, "but we have certain standards to maintain." He glanced meaningfully at James's wheelchair and military jacket, making it clear that his objections had nothing to do with the restaurant's capacity. A couple leaving the restaurant paused near the door, the woman whispering something to her husband while looking disapprovingly at the host. The husband nodded, pulling out his phone and beginning to type. Unknown to the host, social media was about to play a significant role in the evening's events. In his corner booth, Trump's business meeting had come to a complete halt. His associates watched as their host's expression darkened with each passing moment. They had been discussing veteran employment programs just minutes earlier, and now they were witnessing firsthand the kind of discrimination many veterans faced. James took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. He had faced Taliban fire in Afghanistan, endured months of rehabilitation, and rebuilt his life after losing the use of his legs. But somehow, this well-dressed young man's prejudice felt like a different kind of battle entirely. "Listen," James said quietly, his voice steady despite his rising frustration, "I made this reservation weeks ago. I'm here to celebrate a special occasion, and I'd appreciate being treated with the same respect you'd show any other guest." His hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests tightly, knuckles white with tension. The host's response was to shuffle some papers on his podium, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Perhaps I'm not making myself clear," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Our evening clientele expects a certain atmosphere. Surely you understand? There are plenty of other restaurants better suited to your situation." A few feet away, an elderly woman at a nearby table set down her fork with a sharp clink. She had been watching the exchange with increasing distress, reminded of her own husband who had served in Vietnam. The restaurant's supple background music seemed to fade as more people turned their attention to the confrontation. James pulled out his phone again, this time bringing up not just the reservation confirmation but also a photo. "This restaurant was my late father's favorite place," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He brought my mom here on their first date 40 years ago. Today would have been their anniversary, and I wanted to honor their memory." The host's expression flickered for just a moment, a brief crack in his polished facade, but he quickly recovered. "While that's a touching story, sir, it doesn't change our current situation. As I said, we're fully booked." From his vantage point, Trump could see other tables in the restaurant sitting empty. His jaw tightened as he watched the host's continued attempts to turn away a decorated veteran. The former president had always prided himself on his support for military personnel, and what he was witnessing went against everything he believed about how veterans should be treated. The restaurant's other staff members had begun to notice the situation. A young waitress hovered nearby, clearly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing but unsure how to intervene. The bartender kept glancing over while polishing glasses, his movements becoming increasingly agitated. James felt his chest tighten as he remembered all the planning that had gone into this evening. He had even contacted the restaurant ahead of time to ensure they could accommodate his wheelchair, a detail the host was conveniently ignoring. The special occasion he had hoped to honor was turning into a humiliating spectacle. The host continued his supple but firm dismissal, each word carefully chosen to maintain a facade of politeness while making it clear that James was unwelcome. "Sir, if you insist on making a scene, I'll have no choice but to call security. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who might disturb our other guests." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone watching. The only person disturbing the peace was the host himself, with his blatant discrimination thinly veiled behind professional courtesy. The restaurant's elegant atmosphere had become charged with tension, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. What nobody realized yet was that spark was about to come from an unexpected direction. Trump had seen and heard enough. He placed his napkin on the table and began to rise from his seat, his face stuttered with determination. The evening was about to take a dramatic turn that would change not just James's night, but the lives of everyone involved. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet. His fingers brushed past the photograph of his parents he always carried before finding his military ID and Purple Heart documentation. Years of service, sacrifice, and pride were contained in these simple pieces of identification. "I don't often show these," James said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his experiences. "I've never believed in asking for special treatment, but since you seem concerned about your restaurant standards, perhaps these might help you understand who you're turning away." The Purple Heart gleamed under the restaurant's elegant lighting, its purple and gold edges catching the warm glow of the chandeliers. Several nearby diners who could see the metal fell silent. An older gentleman at a corner table removed his glasses and wiped his eyes, recognizing the significance of the decoration. "I earned this in Afghanistan," James continued, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "Our unit was conducting a rescue mission when we came under heavy fire. 2 of my fellow Marines were pinned down. I managed to get them to safety, but in the process," he gestured to his wheelchair, letting the unspoken words hang in the air. The host's expression flickered between discomfort and stubbornness. Other staff members had gathered nearby, watching the scene unfold. A young busboy, who couldn't have been more than 20, stared at the Purple Heart with undisguised awe. "You see," James went on, his tone remaining respectful despite the situation, "I made this reservation to honor my parents. My father was also a Marine. He used to tell me stories about this restaurant. How he saved up for months to bring my mom here on their first date. How the staff treated them like royalty even though they weren't wealthy." He pulled out his phone again, showing a faded photograph that had been carefully scanned. In it, a young couple smiled in front of Le Cirque's entrance, that happiness radiating through the decades. That was them 35 years ago. Dad passed away last year, and Mom followed 3 months later. Today would have been their anniversary. The restaurant had grown so quiet that the soft classical music in the background seemed almost intrusive. A woman at a nearby table dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, while her companion signaled their waiter for the check, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing the discrimination unfolding before them. "I spent 6 months saving up for tonight," James continued, his voice never rising despite the evident pain in his words. "Not because I wanted to make a statement or prove anything. Simply because I wanted to sit where they sat, to feel close to them again, to honor their memory in a place that meant so much to them." The host shifted uncomfortably, but his professional mask remained in place. Around the restaurant, phones had begun to appear in people's hands, some openly recording the interaction, others typing rapidly on social media. The story was already beginning to spread beyond the restaurant's walls. James straightened his jacket, his military bearing evident despite his seated position. "You know what they taught us in the Marines? Dignity, respect, honor. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone we meet. Those values don't disappear just because we take off the uniform." From his corner table, Trump had heard every word. His business associates watched as their host's expression transformed from anger to determination. The former president had attended countless veteran events, but rarely had he witnessed such a powerful demonstration of quiet dignity in the face of discrimination. "I'll leave if you insist," James said finally, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "But I want you to understand something. When you look at this wheelchair, you're seeing a limitation. What you should be seeing is survival, determination, the cost of protecting the very freedoms that allow this restaurant to operate." He began to tuck his military ID and Purple Heart back into his wallet, each movement deliberate and controlled. "Every scar I carry, every challenge I face, came from choosing to put others before myself. That's not a disability, that's strength." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth and dignity. Several diners had completely abandoned their meals, captivated by the quiet power of James's words. Even the kitchen staff had paused their work, listening through the service doors. In his corner booth, Donald Trump had completely forgotten about his business meeting. His steak sat untouched as he listened to every word of James's powerful speech. His associates noticed the familiar look of determination crossing his face, the same expression he wore when he'd made some of his biggest business decisions. "Gentlemen," Trump said quietly to his companions, "sometimes opportunities present themselves in unexpected ways." He dabbed his napkin to his lips, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding at the host station. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had just spent the last hour discussing veterans' employment programs, and now they were witnessing firsthand the challenges veterans faced. The former president watched as other diners reacted to the situation. A wealthy couple near his table were whispering furiously, the wife wiping tears from her eyes. At another table, a group of young professionals had stopped eating entirely, their faces showing a mix of shock and anger at the host's behavior. Trump's security detail, dressed in plain clothes and seated at nearby tables, shifted uncomfortably. They could read their boss's body language and knew he was preparing to act. One of them made eye contact with Trump, receiving a subtle nod that told them to stay put. "You know," Trump said to his associates, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I've owned restaurants, hosted thousands of events, but I've never seen someone handle discrimination with such dignity." He adjusted his tie, a habit his companions recognized as preparation for action. The restaurant's atmosphere had transformed. The usual soft murmur of conversation had been replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the quiet classical music playing overhead. Trump could see phones being raised discreetly around the room. This incident was about to go viral. One of his business associates, a veteran himself, leaned forward. "Sir, this is exactly what we were discussing. The gap between respecting our veterans in theory and in practice." He glanced meaningfully at their earlier conversation notes about veteran employment initiatives. Trump nodded, his jaw set in determination. He'd made countless business deals, appeared on television shows, and served as president, but something about this moment felt different. This wasn't about politics or business, it was about basic human dignity. He watched as James tucked away his Purple Heart, the medal catching the light one final time before disappearing into his wallet. The veteran's quiet strength reminded Trump of countless military ceremonies he'd attended, where he pinned medals on heroes who had sacrificed everything for their country. The host's continued resistance to serving James had struck a particularly sensitive chord. During his presidency, Trump had attended numerous veterans events, visited military hospitals, and met with countless service members. He'd seen firsthand the challenges they faced after returning home. Sometimes, Trump said to his companions, pushing his plate aside, "Leadership means standing up when others won't." He glanced around the restaurant, noting how the elegant decor and expensive furniture seemed to mock the situation's inherent unfairness. His business associates recognized the shift in his demeanor. The meeting was clearly over, but something more important was about to begin. They'd seen this transformation before, when Trump switched from businessman to advocate. Through the windows, the New York City lights twinkled against the darkening sky. The same country these veterans had fought to protect was now watching as one of them faced discrimination in a place that should have welcomed him as a hero. The sound of James beginning to wheel his chair backward, preparing to leave with dignity intact, was the final straw. Trump stood up, straightening his suit jacket. His movement caught the attention of nearby diners, who recognized him immediately. A ripple of whispers spread through the restaurant. The soft classical music playing in the restaurant seemed to fade away as Donald Trump made his way across the dining room. His purposeful stride caught everyone's attention, and a hushed silence fell over the space. The host, still standing at his podium, didn't notice the approaching figure until a shadow fell across his reservation book. "I couldn't help but overhear what's happening here," Trump said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet restaurant. He placed a supportive hand on James's shoulder, the gesture both casual and deliberate. "And I have to say, I'm disappointed in what I'm seeing tonight." The host's face drained of color as he recognized the former president. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Around them, phones were raised discreetly, capturing the moment that was unfolding. "You know," Trump continued, addressing not just the host but the entire restaurant, "I've had the privilege of meeting thousands of our military heroes. But it's not every day you meet someone who earned the Purple Heart saving his fellow Marines." He gestured toward James, who sat straighter in his wheelchair, maintaining his dignified composure. Trump's business associates had moved to stand nearby, creating an impressive presence. The host gripped his podium tighter, his knuckles white with tension. The young busboy who had been watching earlier now stood frozen, holding a stack of menus, completely captivated by the scene. "This man," Trump said, his voice taking on the familiar tone he used at countless rallies and veteran events, didn't just serve our country. He nearly gave his life for it. And now he's here, trying to honor his parents' memory, only to be told he doesn't meet your standards." The word standards hung in the air, heavy with irony. Several diners nodded in agreement, while others looked down at their plates, perhaps reflecting on times they'd witnessed similar discrimination and stayed silent. "Let me tell you about standards," Trump continued, warming to his subject. "Standards are what led this young man to risk his life for his fellow Marines. Standards are what kept him going through months of rehabilitation. Standards are what brought him here tonight, dressed in his military best, to honor his family's memory." The host began to stammer an apology, but Trump held up his hand. "I'm not the one who needs to hear it," he said firmly. Then, turning to the rest of the restaurant, he made an announcement that would soon be shared across social media. "Ladies and gentlemen, this American hero will be dining at my table tonight. And I hope everyone here learned something about real class and dignity from his example." James looked up at Trump, emotion evident in his eyes. "Sir, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't want to disturb your business dinner," he said quietly. Trump's response was immediate and characteristic. "The only business that matters right now is making sure we treat our veterans right." Besides, he added with a familiar grin, "I've never had dinner with a true hero who earned the Purple Heart. This is an honor for me." The restaurant had erupted in applause, not the polite kind that often accompanied celebrity sightings, but genuine, heartfelt appreciation. Several veterans among the diners had stood up, offering silent salutes to James. The young busboy, still clutching his menus, was wiping tears from his eyes. Trump turned back to the host, who seemed to have shrunk several inches behind his podium. "I think we'll need a table for 5, he said, including his business associates. "And make it your best one. Tonight, we're dining with an American hero." The restaurant owner burst through the kitchen doors, his face flushed from running up from his office in the basement after being alerted about the situation. He was a man in his 60s who had inherited the restaurant from his father, and never in his 40 years of running the establishment had he faced such a situation. "Mr. Trump, Mr. Cooper," he said, slightly out of breath, "I cannot begin to express my deepest apologies for this inexcusable incident." His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie. The owner's eyes moved from Trump to James, genuine distress evident on his face. The host stood rigid behind his podium, all his previous arrogance replaced by the realization that his actions had created a crisis for the restaurant. Social media was already buzzing with videos of the incident, and phones throughout the dining room continued to record every moment. "This is not what Le Cirque stands for," the owner continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of family tradition. "My father opened this restaurant with a simple philosophy: treat every guest like family." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. He was a World War II veteran himself. The owner turned to the host, his voice firm but controlled. "Please clean out your station and leave. Your services are no longer required at this establishment." The host's face reddened as he realized the consequences of his actions, but he quietly stepped away from the podium and walked toward the back office. "Mr. Cooper," the owner said, turning back to James, "your dinner tonight will be our honor. And not just tonight. You have a permanent place at Le Cirque any time you wish to dine with us." He pulled out a small gold card from his jacket pocket, the restaurant's exclusive VIP membership card that was typically reserved for celebrities and dignitaries. Trump nodded approvingly as the owner handed the card to James. "Now that's how you treat our veterans," he said, drawing murmurs of agreement from nearby tables. The business associates who had been dining with Trump smiled, knowing their evening's discussion about veteran support had taken an unexpected but powerful turn. The owner personally led the way to Trump's corner booth, which had quickly been expanded to accommodate James and the entire party. The table was reset with the restaurant's finest china and crystal, and the executive chef emerged from the kitchen to introduce himself and offer to prepare any special dishes the group desired. As they settled into their seats, other diners in the restaurant raised their glasses in a spontaneous toast to James. The elderly veteran who had been watching earlier stood up and gave a proper military salute, which James returned with dignity. The atmosphere in the restaurant had transformed from tension to celebration. The young busboy who had witnessed everything approached the table with tears still in his eyes. "Sir," he said to James, My brother is serving in the Marines right now. What you said about dignity and respect, I'm going to write to him about this tonight. Thank you for your service." Throughout the evening, the owner personally oversaw every detail of their service. Extra care was taken to ensure James's comfort, with staff rearranging tables to create easier wheelchair access. What had started as a potential public relations disaster had transformed into a powerful demonstration of respect, dignity, and proper treatment of veterans. Social media was ablaze with accounts of what had happened, with many posts praising both Trump's intervention and the owner's swift response. Local news vans had begun gathering outside, hoping to catch comments from those involved as they left the restaurant. The story of what happened at Le Cirque that evening spread quickly across social media platforms. By midnight, major news networks were running the story, and veteran support groups were sharing it widely. The video clips of Trump's intervention and James's dignified response touched millions of hearts. Within days, the incident sparked a nationwide conversation about how society treats its veterans. Morning shows invited James to share his story, but he remained humble, using each appearance to highlight the broader challenges faced by disabled veterans in their daily lives. The restaurant owner kept his word and went even further. He announced a new monthly tradition at Le Cirque, Veterans Honor Dinners. On the first Monday of every month, the restaurant would close to regular patrons and serve an exclusive dinner to veterans and their families free of charge. Trump and James stayed in touch after that evening. The former president invited James to join his veteran advocacy team, recognizing that his quiet dignity and powerful way of expressing himself could help create real change. Together, they began working on a nationwide initiative to improve veteran services and accessibility. The impact rippled through the restaurant industry. Other high-end establishments across the country began implementing veteran-friendly policies and sensitivity training for their staff. The National Restaurant Association created new guidelines for accommodating disabled guests, using the Le Cirque incident as a case study. The young busboy's letter to his Marine brother went viral after he shared it online. It described not just what happened that night, but the lessons learned about respect, dignity, and standing up for what's right. Military bases around the world shared the story, using it in training sessions about the lasting impact of service. 3 months after the incident, Le Cirque hosted a special event. The restaurant's elegant dining room was filled with veterans from different eras: World War II, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. James sat at the center table with Trump and the restaurant owner. The evening wasn't about the incident anymore. It was about celebrating service, sacrifice, and the positive change that can come from standing up for what's right. Local business schools began using the incident as a case study in crisis management and social responsibility. They noted how the restaurant owner's immediate and genuine response, coupled with concrete actions for change, had turned a potential disaster into a movement for positive change. The former host's story took an unexpected turn as well. After losing his job, he spent time reflecting on his actions and eventually wrote a public apology letter. He began volunteering at a veterans center, learning firsthand about the challenges faced by those who served. His transformation from discriminator to advocate became another powerful part of the story. 1 year later, James returned to Le Cirque on his parents' anniversary. This time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by dozens of other veterans and their families. The restaurant had become a symbol of change, a place where every veteran knew they would be treated with the dignity they deserved. The lasting message of that evening went far beyond a single incident of discrimination and its resolution. It became a reminder that sometimes the quietest acts of dignity in the face of prejudice, combined with the willingness of others to stand up for what's right, can create waves of positive change that touch countless lives.